The royal palace of the Zelthari Empire floated among the clouds of a lavender sky, shining like a city made of glass and silver. Every hallway hummed with soft blue light, and every crystal wall whispered the sound of perfect equations. The Zelthari were not like humans. They lived by logic, spoke through symbols, and believed that mathematics was the language of the universe. And at the very top of this empire sat the alien queen, a ruler of great beauty and power. Her mind could calculate the path of stars and predict the rhythm of time. She was wise, calm, and unshakable, except when it came to her twin daughters, Princess Virel and Princess Nira. The twins were clever in their own way, but when it came to numbers, formulas, and the royal exams called the logic of light, they failed every single time. It was more than embarrassing, it was dangerous. In the Zelthari culture, every royal heir had to pass this test to prove they could lead. Failure meant shame. Failure meant weakness. Failure meant they could not inherit the throne. Every morning, the queen hired the best tutors in the empire, scholars made of crystal and light, teachers who had studied for centuries. They spoke in perfect equations that sparkled in the air like stars. But the more they taught, the more the twins' heads hurt. To them, numbers were like cold chains that made no sense. They couldn't connect the lines, couldn't see the logic. One afternoon, after yet another failed lesson, the royal tutor, a tall, glowing being named Professor Dareth, stormed out of the room. His crystalline body pulsed in frustration. "These children," he muttered in his echoing voice, "are hopeless. No royal in all Zelthari history has ever been this mathematically deficient." The twins sat quietly, staring at their notebooks filled with half-written equations and doodles of stars. They felt small, useless, and alone. That was when Thomas Hale happened to pass by. Thomas was not a scholar. He was the janitor, a simple man from Earth. He worked on the lowest level of the palace, cleaning the glowing halls and polishing the marble floors. No one paid much attention to him. He was quiet, kind, and always humming soft earth tunes while he worked. His life had not been easy. He was a single father, raising his young son back home on a small colony world. When his wife passed away years ago, he took the janitor job among the stars to save money for his boy's future. As he pushed his cleaning cart down the grand hallway, he overheard the twin princesses arguing softly. "This is useless," Nira sighed. "We'll never understand it." "Mother will be ashamed again," Virel whispered, lowering her head. Thomas stopped. He didn't mean to listen, but something in their voices reminded him of his son. The same tone of frustration, the same sadness when homework became too hard. He stepped closer and said gently, "Pardon me, Your Highnesses. I know it's not my place, but maybe I can help." The twins looked up, shocked. "A janitor? Helping with royal math?" Nira frowned. "You? You clean floors." Thomas smiled, not offended. "That's true, but I used to fix machines back on Earth. Math helped me do that. Sometimes a different way of seeing things helps." Virel tilted her head, curious despite herself. "And what do you know about the logic of light?" "Not much," Thomas admitted, "but I know how to make hard things simple." They laughed softly but not unkindly. Something about his calm voice felt safe. "All right, janitor," Nira said. "Show us your magic." Thomas rolled up his sleeves, looked around, and picked up his mop. "Okay," he said, smiling. "Let's say this mop is a number. If I move it once, that's 1 step. Twice, that's 2 steps. But if I move it twice in opposite directions..." He moved it forward and backward. "It cancels itself. Like adding 1 and taking away 1. The twins blinked. It was silly, but they understood. "So you're saying numbers can cancel out? Like motion?" Virel asked slowly. "Exactly." Thomas grinned. "Numbers are just ways to describe patterns, movements, balances, changes. Math isn't scary. It's just another kind of dance." The girls looked at each other amazed. No tutor had ever said it like that. From that day on, Thomas came every evening after his janitor shift. They met in a quiet study room filled with glowing books. The princesses began calling him Mr. Hale, and he brought a small whiteboard he borrowed from the storage closet. He taught them not from formulas but from stories. He compared fractions to sharing food. He explained geometry through the shapes of stars and the way ships turned in space. He made mistakes on purpose, then laughed about them, showing that failure was not shame, it was practice. Sometimes he brought sweets from the kitchen, And they'd have lessons while eating little honey cubes that melted in their mouths. The princesses started to smile more. They asked questions, real questions. They even laughed when Thomas drew funny faces next to their equations. The royal guards noticed. The palace whispered. "The janitor is teaching the princesses," they said in disbelief. But the queen said nothing, and she was watching. Weeks passed. The twins began solving problems their tutors had once said were impossible for them. They started understanding not just how to calculate, but why the numbers worked that way. Then came the queen's command. Thomas was summoned to the throne hall, his mop still in hand. The great doors opened with a sound like thunder. The queen sat upon her crystal throne, her eyes glowing faintly. "You are the human who teaches my daughters?" she asked. Thomas bowed deeply. "Yes, your majesty." "You know our ways forbid commoners from instructing royalty." "Yes, ma'am." "And yet you think you can succeed where my finest scholars have failed?" "I don't think, ma'am," he said calmly. "I hope." The queen studied him for a long, silent moment. Then she spoke. "Very well. You may continue, under one condition. If my daughters fail the next exam, you will be dismissed from the citadel. Forever." Thomas nodded. "Understood." That night he returned to the study room. The twins waited, pale and worried. "What did she say?" Varel asked. Thomas smiled. "She gave us a deal, so let's make sure we win it." They studied harder than ever, but Thomas never made it feel like punishment. He kept things light, turned lessons into games, mistakes into laughter. When Nira struggled with long equations, he compared them to building towers out of blocks. When Varel mixed up symbols, he reminded her, "Numbers are friends. They just need to be introduced in the right order." And slowly, the twins began to believe in themselves. One evening, a strange thing happened. Thomas found them waiting before he even arrived. They had been practicing, together. They proudly showed him a difficult problem they solved without help. He grinned and said, "Well now, looks like the teacher might be out of a job." They both laughed, that bright, musical laughter that fills a room with warmth. At that moment, the queen quietly entered the doorway unseen. She stood there listening, her eyes softening. For the first time, she saw her daughters happy while learning. She didn't interrupt. She just watched. The lesson ended with Thomas writing a simple sentence on the board. "Sometimes it's okay to be wrong before you're right." The twins stared at it, confused. "That doesn't sound very mathematical," Nira said. "It's the most important formula you'll ever learn," Thomas replied. "Because mistakes aren't the end of learning. They're the beginning." When the queen returned to her chambers that night, she couldn't stop thinking about that line. Humans, she thought, were strange creatures. They made errors, stumbled through life, and yet somehow kept improving. They didn't seek perfection, they sought understanding. And that, she realized, might be the one thing her empire's perfect logic had never taught her daughters. As the night sky glowed outside the citadel, the twins studied by candlelight, smiling as they worked through equations that once terrified them. In the quiet corridor beyond, Thomas pushed his mop, humming softly, feeling a warmth in his heart he hadn't felt since teaching his own son back home. Maybe, he thought, being a janitor among stars wasn't such a small job after all. Morning light poured through the tall glass walls of the royal palace, turning the crystal floors golden. The day had come, the day of the final logic of light exam. It was the test that would decide everything. If the twin princesses failed, they would lose their right to the throne. And if they failed, Thomas Hale, the human janitor who had become their secret teacher, would be banished from the palace forever. The entire Zelthari Empire seemed to hold its breath. The queen sat in the royal observation hall, surrounded by scholars and advisors made of shimmering crystal. Below them, in the great examination chamber, Princess Virel and Princess Nira sat at two glowing desks, their eyes focused and calm. Thomas stood quietly at the far corner, wearing his simple janitor uniform, his mop resting beside him. He wasn't allowed to speak, but the twins could see the gentle encouragement in his eyes. He gave them a small nod, a silent message. "You've got this." The exam began. Dozens of problems appeared in the air before them, shining equations that twisted and floated like silver ribbons. The girls had to solve them using both calculation and creativity. The logic of light exam wasn't about memorizing. It was about understanding how numbers could shape energy, time, and matter. The other scholars in the room whispered among themselves. "They'll never manage it," one said. "They've failed too many times before." But Thomas didn't look worried. He knew the girls had changed. Virel took a deep breath and started writing. Her hand moved smoothly, her glowing pen leaving trails of light. Nira followed, her eyes narrowing in concentration. They weren't just repeating steps. They were thinking, reasoning, and trusting themselves. Hours passed. The queen watched in silence, her face calm but her mind restless. She had never seen her daughters work like this. There was confidence in their movements, and a strange rhythm, almost like music. Then, halfway through the exam, the lights flickered. A deep rumble echoed through the palace walls. The glowing equations in front of every student wavered, then scattered like dust. The great logic crystals that powered the testing chamber pulsed and dimmed. "Solar flare detected," shouted one of the scholars. "It's disrupting the logic network." The room filled with panic. The alien tutors tried to repair the system, speaking in sharp tones of code and light. But the crystal equations refused to respond. The logic of light had failed. Without perfect order, the Zelthari scholars could not function. One by one they froze, waiting for instructions. Their minds, so used to flawless logic, could not process the sudden chaos. The queen stood from her throne. "Stop the exam," she ordered. "This test cannot continue under—" But before she could finish, Thomas stepped forward. "With respect, Your Majesty," he said softly, "maybe this is exactly the kind of test they need." The queen frowned. "You think chaos is a lesson?" Thomas nodded. "Sometimes when order breaks, you learn what you're really made of." The twins looked up at him, uncertain. The glowing equations were gone. The system had failed. But Thomas smiled and mouthed one word: "Adapt." Virel took a deep breath. "Let's do it the human way," she whispered to her sister. Nira grinned nervously. "The human way?" "Yeah," Virel said. "Think, guess, try, fix, repeat." They grabbed their pens and began again, this time on paper instead of light screens. They redrew the equations by memory, step by step. Where the Zelthari logic required precision, they used reasoning. Where numbers didn't fit, they looked for patterns. Thomas had taught them that math wasn't just about perfection, it was about problem solving. Minutes turned to hours. Sweat beaded on their foreheads. The scholars in the gallery murmured in disbelief. No Zelthari had ever taken an exam by hand. To them it was primitive. To Thomas it was human brilliance at work. Finally, as the solar flare subsided, a loud hum returned to the crystals. The system came back online. But something unexpected happened. The equations the twins had solved manually began glowing on their own, linking together in beautiful, flowing patterns. Their work had not only completed the exam, but had stabilized the palace's logic crystals, which were flickering out of sync due to the flare. The patterns they created by hand matched the natural rhythm of the energy currents, something the automated system had never done. The crystals pulsed brighter, stronger, more stable than before. The scholars stared in awe. "They repaired the system," whispered one. "Manually." "That's impossible," said another. Thomas smiled faintly. "No," he said. "That's just learning." The queen stood, her eyes wide. Slowly, she descended the stairs from her throne and approached her daughters. The twins stood together, exhausted but proud, holding up their handwritten solutions. The light from the crystals danced across their faces. The queen looked at them, then at Thomas. "You taught them this?" she asked quietly. Thomas shook his head. "No, ma'am, they taught themselves. I just reminded them that it's okay not to be perfect, that it's fine to figure things out the hard way." The queen was silent for a long time. Her gaze softened as she looked at her daughters. "All my life," she said slowly, "I believed that perfection was strength. But today I saw something stronger, the courage to fail and try again. She turned to Thomas. Your people, humans, you see the universe not as numbers, but as stories. You turn fear into curiosity, and somehow that makes you extraordinary. Thomas smiled kindly. We just make mistakes until something works. The Queen chuckled softly, an almost unheard of sound among her people. Then she stepped closer to him and bowed her head, just slightly. Thank you, human. You have given my daughters what I could not, the freedom to learn. Virel and Nira ran to Thomas and hugged him tightly. We did it, Mr. Hale, Nira said, her eyes bright with tears. I knew you would, Thomas said, his voice gentle. I'm proud of you both. That night the Queen held a grand celebration in the palace. For the first time, humans and Zelthari dined together. The scholars told stories of how the princesses had saved the Empire's logic crystals using primitive math, and everyone laughed with joy. Thomas sat at the far end of the table, quietly sipping his tea. He wasn't used to attention, but when the Queen rose to give her speech, she called his name. Thomas Hale, she said, her voice echoing across the hall. In your hands, a mop was a tool of service. In your heart, it became a symbol of wisdom. You have reminded us that greatness does not come from power. It comes from kindness, patience, and understanding. Thomas blushed and stood, bowing slightly. Thank you, Your Majesty. I'm just happy they passed. The hall filled with laughter. The twins waved from their seats, beaming proudly. Later that night, as the party faded and the stars glimmered through the glass ceiling, Thomas walked alone down the corridor, pushing his mop as always. But now the guards nodded respectfully as he passed. Some even smiled. He stopped by the study room, their study room, and looked inside. The whiteboard was still covered with doodles and scribbles, and on the corner was the last thing he had ever written. Sometimes it's okay to be wrong before you're right. He smiled, gently erased it and whispered, Guess we got it right this time. Far away, the Queen stood on her balcony watching him. She spoke quietly to her daughters beside her. Do you see, my children? The power of a humble heart can change even the stars. The twins nodded, their eyes full of warmth. Mother, Virel said softly, I think we finally understand what he meant. And what is that? The Queen asked. That math isn't just about numbers, Nira said. It's about understanding, about trying, failing, and trying again. Just like life. The Queen smiled. Then you are ready to lead. Below them, Thomas kept walking with his mop, humming a soft tune from Earth, a song about learning, hope, and love. He thought of his son back home and smiled, knowing that, somewhere among the stars, a father's lesson had changed a whole empire. Moral and HFY spirit.